Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Fratkin, and this is the Roundtable Chats podcast, a platform where ideas are challenged and the life stories of extraordinary people from around the globe are explored, one conversation at a time. Today, my guest is Dr. Michael Schirripa. Michael is a forensic psychiatrist, indie psych thriller writer, and podcast host of Mindhunt. We do a deep dive into this riveting field that fuses law with psychiatry and also discusses life story. Enjoy this stimulating episode, and without further ado, here is Dr. Michael Schirripa. Michael, welcome to the round table.
Thank you, Thomas. It's lovely to be here. I'm thrilled that you've asked me to be on today.
Yeah, so happy to have you. The first question I always like to ask my guests is, what are you grateful for?
Thomas, that is such a great question, and it really got me thinking. And I'm grateful for so many things, but if I had to narrow it down, I think first and foremost, it's the personal attachments that I have with the closest people around me. You know, my wife, my children, my immediate family. I think that being bonded to them and having them in my life is something that, you know, I probably don't express the gratitude enough, but I certainly feel it talking to you now. You know, I can really feel, you know, just how important they are to me, and really to be isolated from them or to not have them in my life is such a frightening idea that, you know, it makes me appreciate it all the more. And you know, I think a lot of this stems from the fact that I'm actually an adopted child. And so one thing that I'm incredibly grateful for, beyond the people that are in my life, is that I've always known that I was adopted. My adopted parents always told me that, you know, from the earliest years of my life. You know, I can remember just knowing that I was adopted into this family, and they went to sort of great lengths to explain it to me as a child so that I really understood, because I've seen in life other people who only, you know, find this out when they're much older, you know, like teenagers or even as adults. And it can be quite a traumatic experience, I think, at that age to find that out about yourself. So I think in terms of gratitude, that's certainly something I'm incredibly grateful for. But one other thing, if I can quickly add, I'm also grateful for my imagination. I think it's a double-edged sword, imaginations, but you know, I think in nature, I think, you know, and particularly working as a psychiatrist, I think, you know, it's one of the most sophisticated, if not, I think, the most sophisticated entity that exists in nature. You know, the human imagination. It's something that just, I think, sets us apart from really any other living thing. So to have that, and to again, I think it's something we often take for granted a lot of the times, but it is something that is just so important to all of us, because I think particularly in times of great despair or times of suffering, we can all find a place in our imagination to go to, whether that gives us a sense of hope or an idea of what our future might be, or conjuring up in our minds, you know, the important people in our life. I think our imagination is something that can get us through so many difficult times. And so, you know, I'm grateful that I've got that, because many times that has helped me, you know, throughout life. So I've got a lot to be grateful for, Thomas.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, it's funny. When you said imagination, I was like, what would the world be like if imagination didn't exist? If we couldn't imagine anything? I mean,
Well, that's a great question. And I think it would be, well, I think it would be clearly vastly different. And I think it would be very sort of prosaic and very repetitive. And really, I think it would just be all about what's in front of us, survival, just what's the next thing in front of us. How do we feed ourselves? How do we shelter? That would be about it. So I think it would be a very sort of soulless existence in many ways.
yeah, yeah. it's hard to imagine other animals having souls. I mean, I guess it's not something you can prove or disprove, but
Yeah.
it's interesting to think about. But yeah, I'd love to find more about how you became a forensic psychiatrist. I was looking, I was doing some research about that, and I thought it was
Yeah,
really interesting. And so, yeah, just more about your backstory.
absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's a bit of a long and convoluted tale because you know when I was a kid, becoming a doctor and certainly becoming a psychiatrist was one of the furthest things from my mind.
Hmm.
I actually wanted to, I don't know whether it was too much Indiana Jones, but when I was a kid, all I wanted to be was an archaeologist. And, I was fascinated by ancient Egypt and I loved going to the museum here to look at all the artifacts and all of that. But I was quite, I was quite sick as a child with asthma. And my mum would always say to me, well, you couldn't really ever do that because you'd be out in all those dusty places and with your asthma digging around in there, you would never tolerate that. So I thought, oh, you might be right there. I better find something else. But, right throughout high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. My first interaction with psychiatry was with a neighbour or the son of a neighbour who lived right next door to us. Now, he was probably about 8 to 10 years older than me. And he, as I realised later, he suffered from quite severe paranoid schizophrenia. And he was often in and out of hospital, medicated at times, not medicated at times. He'd have periods of wellness, he'd have periods of being quite unwell and quite psychotic. And unfortunately, when he was unwell, he would become very irritable, angry, very distressed, and it would lead to these enormous arguments and fights. And I could sort of hear this as though they lived right next door to us. And so as a 12, 13, 14-year-old kid, I would sort of hear this going on. But at the same time, I knew this guy as a person, and he was really into music and had this great stereo set up at his place, and we were very friendly with them. So we'd often talk about music, and he'd seem really enthusiastic. And then at other times, I'd see him quite psychotic, and I was trying to. I found it sort of fascinating, but also somewhat frightening. I couldn't quite understand it. So that was my first introduction to psychiatry, and it really made me wonder what this was all about. What had happened to him? Why was he unwell? And as I got towards the end of high school, I wanted to go to medical school then because that started to appeal to me. But I just didn't feel I had the confidence to do that. So I went off and did an arts degree first, majoring in English Lit. And when I was doing that, I did a lot of psychoanalytic type of studies in terms of my English degree, which I found also fascinating as well, the unconscious and all of that. So by the time I got into to medical school, I quickly worked out that I really enjoyed the more humanities-based side of medicine, and that certainly included psychiatry. I loved sort of working with people rather than on people. I wasn't really a proceduralist, a surgeon. I didn't really enjoy the hard science of medicine, but I just loved hearing people's stories and listening to people and trying to make sense of what was happening with them. So that, I think, was a key driver for me, all of those experiences coming together to push me towards psychiatry. But then in terms of the forensic psychiatry, when we train as psychiatrists, we do 6-month rotations through all the subspecialty areas of psychiatry. So you'll do 6 months of child psychiatry, you might do 6 months of addiction psychiatry. And then I went and did my 6-month placement in forensic psychiatry and just was instantly sort of fascinated by that intersection between mental health, the legal system, sort of crime, and all of those broader sort of sociological issues that would come up in forensic psychiatry. And you were dealing with patients and seeing patients who unfortunately were often at their sort of lowest ebb in life. Not only were they suffering from severe mental illnesses, the time that they'd committed their criminal offending, like schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. They become psychotic, but also, they were incarcerated. They were, they were facing all these legal problems as well. So I felt that within the broader scope of the mental health sector, they were the patients who really needed the most help and really the most understanding as well. And I love the forensic analytic aspect of it as well, of going through their past histories, which you have to do for assessments and all of that. So it was that total package, Thomas, that I think really sort of drew me into that forensic world.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. A follow-up question I have is, like, what precisely is psychosis? Like, what's happening in the mind of a paranoid schizophrenic when they're experiencing psychosis?
That's a great question, Thomas. So what we mean by psychosis is someone has lost touch with reality. So that manifests itself primarily with delusional thinking. So a delusion is this really fixed, false, strongly held belief that really is not sort of shakeable by any sort of rational or logical conversation, or trying to convince the person otherwise. And it's something that's not in keeping with that person's particular sort of cultural or sort of educational background. So a lot of people would be familiar with the idea of paranoid delusions or persecutory delusions, where a person has this delusional belief that they're being spied upon or poisoned, or there's some conspiracy against them, either from another individual person, or from a government or a corporation. There's some persecution that is being deliberately and maliciously directed towards them for some purpose. But of course, in objective reality, this is not happening. But in their own subjective world, this is very real and is often quite frightening for them to experience. So that's the thinking side of psychosis, in terms of them losing touch with reality, with rational thought. One of the other key symptom groups of psychosis are hallucinations. So these are disturbances of our 5 perceptual senses. And the most common that people would be probably more familiar with is auditory hallucinations or hearing voices. So this is when a person who's psychotic is hearing voices coming in through their ears, much like we're talking now. And of course, there's actually no one there. Or if there is someone there, that person has actually not spoken a word. So you can have those sorts of hallucinations in all the modalities. So you can have visual hallucinations where you will see things, often people who are not there. You can have olfactory hallucinations where you smell things, taste, touch. But the most common ones for sure are the auditory hallucinations. So what's happening is parts of the person's brain, often in terms of their frontal lobe area, but also in terms of their language centers, is producing too much dopamine. And that is the primary neurotransmitter or the brain chemical that is out of balance when we're talking about psychosis. So a lot of treatment, of course, is geared towards trying to re-establish that balance of that dopamine pathway in the brain, so that those circuits, those neural circuits within the brain, are back to functioning how they should be. So it's a condition that is very heterogeneous, unique symptoms for unique people. But as a broad category, that's generally what's happening when someone's experiencing a psychotic episode.
Yeah, very interesting. On the dopamine piece, I remember listening to a podcast with Andrew Huberman, the neurobiologist from
Oh,
Stanford.
yes, yep, yep.
And he said something that really blew my mind, which is, with dopamine, it's not so much about pleasure, but about motivation. And
yes,
I've had some experience that with people with like bipolar disorder, for instance, when they're having a manic episode, they can't calm down, they can't slow down, because my thought about it is that because you're just constantly having this dopamine and you're being motivated, and
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Thomas. That's exactly what happens. And it's interesting because if you could imagine, our brains are wired up in circuits, much like, say, the motherboard inside a computer, or also sort of a series of like railway tracks in a way. So we do have like different regions within our brain that generally do different functions. However, they are all interconnected by this sort of circuitry. So it depends really where that circuitry is being overloaded with dopamine that will kind of determine the types of symptoms that you're going to experience in a psychotic episode. So again, for example, if you have an excess in the occipital lobe, which is right at the back of our brains and controls vision, then you're more likely to have visual hallucinations. But if it's sort of on the side of our brain, sort of that temporal lobe region, which controls language, then you're more likely to have the auditory hallucinations. And sort of, imaging now is getting more and more sophisticated at being able to light up different parts of the brain when people are experiencing psychosis. So we are moving along that path of really being able to very precisely, work out in individual patients, where things are actually going wrong. And that's only going to help to develop more nuanced and sophisticated treatments that ultimately we can tailor, even hopefully right down to the individual patient in terms of really getting on top of their symptoms. Because even though we've come a long way in terms of treatment, there is still a long way to go. There is, unfortunately, still a lot of treatment-resistant patients out there whose symptoms only get marginally better or not much better, even though they're receiving really good pharmacological and other treatments for their psychotic disorders.
Yeah, I was just thinking, when I was in Boulder, Colorado, I had a roommate who was paranoid schizophrenic, and I went on a night walk with him, and he was telling me about what he was seeing, and things like that.
Wow.
And I don't know what happened to him later on after I moved on, but the question I was always plagued with is like, how do you help somebody when they're having a psychotic break or episode?
Well, it can be very difficult because, of course, we're talking about people who, as we said, have unfortunately lost touch with reality. So because of that, it's almost impossible to try to sort of logically or rationally sort of argue, or not argue with them, but talk to them about what's going on. The best way of helping is to keep them safe by trying to help them get some sort of treatment. Now, of course, that is extremely difficult in some of these conditions because the very nature of the conditions often means that the person lacks insight into what's happening. Of course, they don't believe they're unwell. They believe delusion X or delusion Y, and that's their reality. So people can become very resistant to help and treatment, and may get angry and irritable if people do try to help them. But I think one of the helpful things is to just broadly be there for that person in just a supportive and caring manner. It's not about questioning what they're experiencing, but to just let them know that I'm here for you. If I can help you, I will help you. Whatever you're going through, I'm here to listen to you. I'm not going to, make fun of you or laugh at you or, but I'm just here to hear your experience, first of all, and know that I'm someone you can turn to. Because, of course, people going through, paranoia and persecution can feel very, very alone and isolated.
Yeah.
And if they're further marginalised by people behaving in those ways, that can only make things worse. But I think if they can somehow feel that connection to someone else, that can build a little bit of trust, and therefore can help sometimes guide people to a treatment pathway, for example. But it can be very difficult, that's for sure.
Yeah, I always felt like the people who need the most help. I mean, paranoid schizophrenia, just trying to empathize what that would be like, and it's like
Yes.
how can you hold a job? How can you have a family? How can you know do these things? Um, when you can't trust reality. So
Yes, that's right. And you're absolutely right, Thomas. And unfortunately for some people, that holding a job or having a family is just too much pressure for them to bear, and it's just too difficult. Um, However, saying that, with some of the significant progress that's been made in antipsychotic treatments over the last, say, 20 or 30 years, it has been able to restore huge levels of functioning to people who otherwise, say in the 1960s or 1970s or even the 1980s, may not have ever held down a job or found a family. But in the last 30 years, we have come some way in helping to restore functioning, and not just because of pharmacology, but through occupational therapy services, through other community employment programs, the psychological therapies. As a package, they can really help to restore functioning. And contemporary psychiatry it's good to see, because it's moving away from that traditional focus on symptoms, diagnosis, and really looking more at function. What can we help you to do with your life? Okay, you've got symptoms, we can help with those, but let's focus on what you want from life as an individual. How can we actually help you to get back to functioning, whatever that might mean for you? So it's really good to see that things are moving more down that pathway of helping to restore function, and really getting back to seeing people as humans first, not just as people with all these psychotic symptoms. I think that's a really positive step, and I'm hoping that trajectory continues forward.
yeah, I think we can count on science and scientists to keep pushing this, and pharmacologists and everything. No, it's incredible how effective medication can be, and in the progress that's been made. Like for instance, my grandfather was bipolar, and he was one of the first
Yes.
patients to receive lithium. And as soon as he was put
Oh,
on
wow.
lithium carbonate, that had such a magnificent effect, and he was able to have a much more stable life and get on with things. And so
Yes.
it's really interesting.
And there's a nice Australian connection there, because in the 1950s, it was an Australian psychiatrist in Melbourne, John Cade, who really was a pioneer in understanding and using lithium to help in the very early days with bipolar disorder. So you're right, it was such a groundbreaking treatment for so many people, and is still very much today, a frontline
Yeah.
effective and safe treatment for bipolar disorder. So yeah, it's quite remarkable, really.
Yeah, and it's interesting with lithium, right? If I'm not mistaken, it's we don't fully understand why it works, right? Um,
Yes, yes.
and I remember there's a story of like lithium carbonate being put into like a water supply or something in Texas. I forget the full details of the story,
Oh
and
yes,
it had
yeah.
a very calming effect with the community
Yes.
there.
Well, maybe we should be doing more of that.
Yeah, right. Especially in America right now with the election
Well,
and
yeah,
everything. Yeah.
I know it's an election year there, so
But I want to know how you transition now into being a writer, and if that's always been a practice in your life, or what that process is like with writing.
it, great question again, Thomas, because it's always been a part of my life. As I said a few minutes ago, when I was a kid, I was quite unwell with asthma. So I had a lot of time off of school particularly when I was quite young, hospital, taking steroids, all of that sort of stuff to treat asthma, bronchitis, pneumonias, like every winter was the same. So I would spend a lot of time reading, because I was often stuck in bed. And so I really developed this sort of passion for reading. And I remember, as a kid, I had an older sister, or have an older sister, and I'd break into her bedroom and steal her Stephen King novels when I was a kid, much to my mother's, sort of horror. And, I'd read all these words that I was like, oh, I've never read that before. So I was really, it was really an invigorating time as a kid. And I thought, I'm going to try and write some of these stories. So I'd try and write these little stories, when I was a kid, just to pass the time. And I found that, again, getting back to imagination, I thought this is great because it kind of takes me away a bit from just feeling so average, feeling so sick and having to take these medications and all of that. So I always enjoyed, as I said earlier, English, the humanities, writing, all of that. And I always would be tinkering around with short stories or ideas for books, but then, life kind of gets in the way and it's like, economic priorities first, and then I can come back to that. And then, then you're in medical school and that's just this all-consuming experience. And then you're doing your residency or training, all-consuming experience. But it always stayed with me. And what really, sort of was a catalyst in many ways for me sort of starting this novel was that my Italian grandfather, so my dad's father in my adoptive family, he had a fascinating life history. He came out from Italy at the age of 16 on his own with nothing and lived this very interesting life. So he was approaching his 90th birthday. And I thought, it would be a great idea to get down his life stories before, if anything happened to him, because they're so interesting. So I did this series of interviews with him over a period of months before his birthday, and I had enough material to turn it into a book. So I actually wrote his biography and got it sort of printed up, and at his 90th birthday, I sort of did a bit of a speech and presented everyone with a copy and all of that. But it was funny because doing that really was a catalyst then for me to start getting back to fiction again, because, I found that once I actually sat down and started, say, typing out his story, it just sort of flowed and I could get a bit of momentum. So then I thought, well, I've got this idea for this psychiatric thriller, so I might just start jotting that down, and then, a few pages. So it was really that family, personal connection that was the catalyst for me to get going. But then it was really my work then as a psychiatrist and, particularly as a forensic psychiatrist, that gave me some of the ideas and content for this book. So it was really those two elements coming together that led to me being able to finish it off. So it's been a long road. It's ebbed and flowed. I've left it for some time, come back to it, but then in the end, finally managed to finish it, and it's in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be released, which is very exciting.
Nice. Okay. Wow. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
It's funny, while you're speaking, I was looking at your bookshelf behind you, that's overflowing with
yes.
books, which I love. I'm also an avid reader, and I don't know what I'm going to do with all my books because I usually read about 50 to 60 books a year. And so I'm thinking, like, I have this small apartment in Utrecht, and I'm like, I can't just have these books everywhere. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do with them.
Oh, it's such a dilemma, isn't it? Because, I am a fan of the ebook. Don't get me wrong. I think there's nothing like the physical book, though. There's nothing like the feel, the smell, the feel of the pages and all of that. But yeah, space is, we're very lucky in Australia because we're blessed with a lot of space. So it's the perfect place to live if you want to have a large physical book collection. So any listeners out there, you can move to Australia and have as many books as you like. So don't forget that.
There you go.
It is a tough dilemma.
Yeah, I'm thinking all the people on Threads now who are book lovers, that's a good idea for them.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I should put that in a post, actually. I think that would go down well. I'll invite them all out here, so,
That's great. And if you could like recommend one book for our listeners to read that like really had an impact on your life or really stood out,
Yeah.
which would it be?
Oh, of course, my own book. But no, I'll give you Mindhunt, everyone.
There you go.
No, well, one book that I must say, and this feeds perfectly into what we've spoken about already, Thomas. So the American novelist Wally Lamb, back in the 1990s, wrote this incredible novel called I Know This Much Is True, which is a fictional depiction of two twin boys in the Midwest of the United States, one of whom is mentally healthy and quite successful. The other twin, though, suffers from quite severe paranoid schizophrenia. And it is just a beautiful, articulate, accurate description of what one brother goes through with his mental illness, the symptoms that, like we were saying, that loss of function at times, the struggles with getting the right treatment, but also, you know, the absolute love and affection of his twin brother, who also, you know, is somewhat racked by guilt because he is sort of like, you know, the brother has this devastating condition, you know, so he feels, I think, obligated to, but there's an incredible bond and love between them. And it just, you know, if I teach medical students or residents and they ask, I always say, if you want to read one book, one fictional book, read I Know This Much Is True, because it is just such a, you know, it is completely moving as well, but such a brilliantly written book. It's very lengthy. I think it's about 900 pages, but it doesn't feel like a long book because it's so it's just so humanistic and just so articulate. So if anyone wants to get even greater understanding about psychosis or schizophrenia, then that is definitely a book that I would strongly recommend anyone reads, no matter who you are, because it's so insightful.
Yeah, thank you for that. No, that sounds incredible. Switching gears a little bit,
Yeah.
something else I'm curious about with you, with your life. I mean, it sounds like you've had this brilliant trajectory, but is there anything you regret having done or having not done with your life?
Well, there is. There absolutely is. And that's another great question and one that really sort of has had me thinking. I think from a very personal point of view, I think one thing that I regret as a young boy and then as a teenager was not learning Italian. Now I say that because so here I was, you know, adopted into this Italian family, and so, you know, culturally I was raised in this fantastic Italian life, you know, really family, food, you know, wine. Every Sunday, without fail, we would meet up at my grandparents' house for Sunday lunch. It would be, you know, my family, cousins, uncles, aunts, and, you know, we'd all sit on this one long table, you know, in order of importance, you know. Back then, you know, my grandfather would sit at the head of the table, and then there'd be his four sons, my dad and his brothers, then we'd go down, and then the kids would be sort of down the other end of the table, you know. Everyone had their, you know, but it was that, you know, that communal feast, really, of family coming together. And my grandmother was just this amazing Italian cook, and, you know, all of that, you know. And so I really regret, because my grandparents could speak English, and they were very, very they very much wanted to speak English because, you know, they wanted to sort of, you know, fit in, and, you know, they were migrants. When they came to Australia, they had no English, so they'd learnt it when they were here. So they really wanted to speak English. So I regret, though, not taking the opportunity to learn a second language like Italian, because I think that really enriches all of our lives so much if we can be bilingual. And at school, there was the option to do it, but I only did it for a year. And then I was, you know, 13, 14, distracted by just other things at school and in life, and didn't really see it as a priority then. So I regret that. But having said that, it's never too late, and we can always learn languages as adults. So that's one thing. But the other thing I probably regret a lot was when you're a sort of a medical student, and in particular when you're a junior doctor and you're doing your specialty training, you form this belief that you are just so dependent on the training system that you're in. You need them to just further your career. So as a consequence of that, there is bullying that is so rife amongst medical trainees, from senior staff, from other doctors. So when you're a junior trainee coming through, you get bullied quite an enormous amount at times, but you just sort of tolerate it because you think, I just have to. Because if I stand up, then I'll get cut from the program, I'll be kicked out of my training, and then what do I do? And I've worked so hard to get here. I just want to keep my head down and just try to get through. And you see it amongst your colleagues, and you see it cause great, despair and great distress among your junior colleagues as well, to see the senior staff bullying them like this. So I wish, my regret with all of that is that, I wish I had been a stronger advocate against that back then, or stood up to that a bit more, because when you come through the other side, you realise that, in fact, they need you as much as you need them. They need you, the junior staff, to prop up the services at the hospital or the health service where you're working. So, no one's going to cut you from a program or just get rid of you because you don't want to be bullied anymore. So at the time, though, it's hard to see that, because you are often just thinking about, your career and not wanting to ruffle any feathers.
Right.
But I hope and I think things have come a long way in the last 20 odd years since I did my training, where that sort of behaviour, even though it probably still does go on, it's hopefully lessened now, and it's a gentler experience for the trainees. So that's probably the biggest regret that I would have looking back. But I don't feel, though, other than that, even though I've made a lot of mistakes, I don't necessarily see them as regrets, because I think we can learn from mistakes, and we all do them. So that's okay. As long as we can learn from them and move on in that sense, I think it's okay.
Yeah, it's so funny. I have a mirrored experience with you with Italy. It's with me with France. So my mother's French. She's from
Right.
Marseille.
Yes.
And I was so lucky growing up every summer going to my French grandparents' chalet in the Alps, and visiting my uncle and aunt in Marseille at Le Corbusier apartment, and just seeing that there's two ways to live life, right? Or at least two ways. So like I was used to in America, where it's like work, grind, have your 15-minute lunch, da da da.
Yes.
And then in France, it's like 4-hour dinners and just the art of conversation, and everything revolves around the mouth, whether it's kissing or talking or eating.
Yeah, true, yeah.
So,
yeah.
So I really
Very
resonate
similar.
with what you were saying, and like,
Yeah.
I really like Italians though. Like in my research master program that I was doing, I had an Italian professor and an Italian student in the program, and seeing them interact and with their hands and the language, I was so encaptured by that. I really love that.
Yeah, that's right. yeah. That very animated style.
Yeah.
It is that sort of passion for life and love and all of those sorts of things that flows through. So I'm totally with you there. So
Nice, yeah. Kind of different kind of question. If you could say anything to the world, like you have this broadcast message here, what would it be and why?
Great question, Thomas. I think if I could say one thing, it would be the need to understand is so much more important than the need to be right. And I think when saying that, it's very much like there's a lot to be said for peace. There really is. And I think that comes through understanding. And this is something that I talk to my patients a lot about in sort of psychotherapy as well, is that the goal here, what we're doing, me as the therapist, you as the patient, is we're trying to understand what's happening in your world. That's what we're trying to do. Because if we can understand it, if we can make sense of it, then we're not going to judge it. And you're not going to judge yourself, because I think we do that a lot. If there's something we don't understand, I mean, we see it play out in the world all the time, and it can lead to horrific conflicts and horrific violence and horrific outcomes for people where we don't understand. So I'm just going to judge you. And that's really what I'm getting at. This is, and therefore I'm right, you're wrong, and that's it. Whereas I think understanding and taking the time to listen and quietly reflect and just try to think about what is happening, why things are happening, and that there are perhaps multiple reasons why something may be happening. Even that, I think, sometimes is enough to just take the emotional heat sometimes out of things, to take the judgment out of things, and for people to just really be able to see each other as more complex, more nuanced beings than we might otherwise see, rather than just saying, well, you must be this, or you must be just like that, full stop, that sort of idea. So that's if I could give the world a message, it's a bit lofty and ambitious, I know, but if I could, that would be what I would say to them, because I see it so much, as I said, in my patients who are just so self-judgmental and so self-critical, and a lot of times that in itself can be something that drives their depression, this self-judgment. And a lot of that does stem from just them not having the opportunity or the chance to take a step back and just try to understand themselves a bit more, just try to understand what's going on. And so therefore it's just like, well, I must be this bad person because, well, hang on a minute, let's just pull that apart and think more about why you've ended up here, what's happened to you. There's a lot of things that have gone on in your life that have led to you to this situation. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person who deserves to be depressed. There could be a whole lot of other things that you haven't had the time or space yet to think about. So coming to see me, let's find that space. Let's just find that time and space. It's just you and me. Let's just think about what's going on. And I think that over time, it can, time and repetition can start to just break down some of those very self-critical barriers that people build up and drive their depression. So I think that would be a big message if I could get out there to the world. I would love to get that out there. So, I think that would be lovely to see people just taking the time to just, understand before they judge, or not judging, but understanding,
Yeah, similar in that vein, I wrote a piece called Responding versus Reacting, where I'm much more in favor of, taking the time, really understand, and form a response instead of your gut, emotional reaction, which I'm sure uses different regions in the brain. I'm sure like the amygdala is probably involved with reaction.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas responding would be more maybe the prefrontal cortex and really thinking.
Absolutely right. So, yes, synthesizing that information, definitely. Yeah.
Because otherwise it's just so easy to just misunderstand and have these horrible conflicts in the context of a marriage or in the context of a relationship. Just really listening. That's something I've been practicing for a while, and it's amazing when you give someone the space to speak, how much they'll open up, and there's nothing greater than feeling like you're heard by somebody.
I couldn't agree more, Thomas. That is so true. What you've just said there about how if you give people just that bit of time and space, they will open up. That's so important. And a lot of in psychotherapy, which we train in as well as psychiatrists, that sort of talking therapy.
Yeah.
A lot of what we're taught is the therapeutic value of psychotherapy is actually really in the relationship that you have with the patient. It's not, you don't need to come up with fancy, sophisticated interpretations of what they've said or what they've done, or, you know, dream analysis or anything like that. But what you need to be is this reliable, consistent, listening, non-judgmental clinician who will give them time and space and give them a safe space where they know they can come along and, as you say, talk and open up. And, you know, because it always astounds me, and I still find this, I still can't quite get used to this after all these years, the number of people that I see that just do not have, they have people in their lives, but they don't have really anyone in their life who will actually listen to them, who will actually just give them any space. It's just remarkable. I mean, another thing that I'm grateful for, I do have people in my personal life who I can talk to and who will give me space. But it's very sad to think there are so many people out there where they just don't have a single person who'll do that. So it's very rewarding then, in a way, to be that therapist who can be there and be that person for them. But it's just, you know, it's such an enormous problem out there for so many people. It's incredible. Yeah, it's very eye-opening.
Yeah, I mean, we totally have a loneliness epidemic, and I feel like the smartphone and social media and all these things and just how that's progressing, and I like to think like what's happening to our attention span, like with the invention of like Vine videos that were 7 seconds, and TikTok is similar. It's like, what's next? You know, is it just 1 second jolts just into your brain? And what's that going to do to us? Yeah.
I totally agree that interplay now, as you say, technology and that rapid pace of technological advancement and change, and what that is actually doing to us as humans and our ability to reflect and think and have time and space. We're just so much of life now, you know, everything's just so on demand now. You know, I can pretty much lie in bed with my smartphone and pretty much order anything from a new car to a pizza, and, you know, pretty much have it delivered to my front door without getting out of bed.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which I can't, you know, which ultimately I don't know that that's a helpful thing.
You know? Yeah, there is like too much pleasure, or too much convenience.
Yeah. But I think as part of that as well is there's sort of it is like that sort of that drive for, you know, it's sort of almost like information in a way, you know, like, again, I can just, with a computer, a laptop, my phone or whatever, I can try to find out sort of anything about anything in an instant, you know, whereas the idea of, you know, knowing how to think, being able to think for myself, being able to work through a problem myself and understand something for myself and come to my own conclusions about something, I think we never want to lose that. And that's where I think fear, will our imaginations somehow be eroded over time as technology becomes just, you know, such a part of us in so many ways, that begins to replace certain imaginative aspects of our minds. You know, I would hate for that to happen, but I think there's a chance that it might, if, you know, with the pace of, you know, technological change and AI and all of those things, it is a worry.
Yeah, I think there's just, people are spending too much time consuming. I mean, and for good reason. I mean, the amount of content on Netflix, the amount of content on YouTube is astounding. And TikTok and all these things. And it's so sad to me. I mean, maybe you can resonate with this. Like, when I walk into the world, I always have a book in my hand wherever I go. And it always makes me sad that less and less I don't see anyone else with a book. It's just a phone, you know? And I'm like, am I the only one who's reading while waiting for a train, or reading on a train ride, or whatever, you know? It's so interesting.
Absolutely.
The one thing that was nice was, recently I was taking a train from Utrecht to Amsterdam, as I often do, because it's like a 25-minute ride. There's this girl sitting next to me who was doing art, and so I thought that was great, you know. So that was a good change of pace.
That's very reassuring to hear that, because it's so often the case we just see people walking around just staring at a screen that's like 3 inches from their nose, and that's about it, oblivious to the rest of the world. It's a beautiful sunny day.
Yeah.
The birds are singing. There might be a gentle with the breeze, but no, it's that fixation on the phone.
Yeah, I call it iZombies. That's my name.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
taking over.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting. Steve Jobs, I was reading his biography when he came up with the iPhone and everything. He was very strict that he would never use social media. Like that was something he strictly stayed away from.
Right.
So yeah, but
interesting.
Yeah, just something to think about.
Yeah, definitely.
To keep continuing, a question I love to ask is, who would you most love to have a coffee conversation with?
Another great question, and I've given this a lot of thought, and I would, now listeners, don't judge me when I say this, but I would actually love to have a coffee conversation with Taylor Swift.
Oh,
now,
nice.
The reason why I say that is because I am a big fan of hers. I will put my hand up and admit that, so that there'd be that sort of fan thing, sure. But I'm endlessly fascinated by human motivation, okay, and creativity. I think those two things are really, really interesting to me, and particularly, through the work that I do with patients as well. What motivates them, what actually drives them to do the things they do, and so, are they driven by their illness, or are they driven by their personality, or other factors? But in someone like her, I'm just fascinated by her drive to continue with this sort of work ethic, this lyricism that she can come up with, this storytelling capacity that she has. And I think that's why she is so successful in many ways. Is, I feel, to me, ultimately she's a storyteller, and she tells stories that just resonate with so many people, of course, about love and loss and grief and, hurt in so many ways, and the struggles of human dynamics, the struggles of human relationships, and, and all of that. And I think she's fundamentally a storyteller that uses music as the platform to tell stories, and but here is someone who, by any measure, we would say this person is a success in so many ways. But at the same time, she is still incredibly vulnerable underneath all of that, in terms of, personal difficulties perhaps, or, relationship problems, or that sort of thing. But when someone has achieved so much at such a young age, what drives you now? I would be fascinated to try to understand that. Like how do you keep going when there's no longer any economic or financial imperative for you to keep going? You could never work a day in your life again, and, still have more money than you'd know. So that's not probably, I imagine, not a driver now. So what is it within you? What is it? Is it a creative urge? What is the motivation that keeps driving you now to keep moving, keep reinventing yourself in a way? I think all of those questions I would really be fascinated by in someone like her. Just as an example of someone who, I was lucky enough to go to the Eras Tour concert when it was in Melbourne here in Australia, and it was a wonderful, because the atmosphere in the crowd was like no other concert that I'd been to. There was this sort of enormous camaraderie amongst everyone there. There was this communal happiness, and and I think, wow, that's really amazing that her stories through her music really has been able to bind all of these people together. So I think that would be a fantastic coffee date to have.
I would want to be a fly on the wall for that one because she's got something. There's got to be some thing she's doing that's keeping her to be perform at this high of a level. And someone I thought in a similar vein I would want to talk to, someone I didn't care for a long time, but now I'm very curious about, is Justin Bieber, because he started right when he blew up when he was 13, and like I can't even fathom that. I'm thinking of where I was in life at 13 years old, and to have that level of attention and crazy fans and just all this stuff. And I feel like he's really mellowed out recently and is more introspective and things. And I guess that's someone I would have a coffee conversation with, just to say, what now? Like a similar vein.
That's right. That's what. Yeah. And what's going to drive you forward? I remember watching the documentary Miss Americana, which was made a few years ago about her, which kind of followed her around. And there was a particular album, I can't remember which one it was, but one of the albums she released, it might have been Reputation possibly, but she gets the call from her agent to say, well, you actually haven't been nominated for Grammy for Best Album of the Year or something like that. Mm-hmm. And her immediate response to that was, well, next time I'll just make a better album. There was this, like, well, that's fine. I love that there was just this sort of, well, that's fine. I'll just work harder and I'll just do a better job then. There was no there's no like, no tantrum or no sort of, well, that's ridiculous. How could that? It's just like, well, I'll just, I find that really impressive. I really do. I think, to say, right, well, I need to examine maybe what I've done and just see, well, where can I improve? What could I do differently? I think that's a really fascinating idea.
Yeah, and now she's in this really interesting position with the upcoming election where I assume most of her fans will be Biden supporters. And so she could actually, it's going to be so close. So she could actually, push the needle.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I've heard some of the, speaking of paranoia, I've seen some of the conspiracy theories going around, obviously from probably more the Republican side of things, about it was all her and Travis Kelce, it was all a setup. It was all to get her to influence the election for the Democrats, and, their whole relationship has been sort of, forged out of that. And
yeah, they just wish she was on their team, That's
yes, I think that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so, well, wonderful answer to that question. That was great. I really like asking that question.
Yeah. Believe me, if Taylor Swift and I ever have a coffee date, I promise you there'll be a photo on social media. So everyone
That's so great. Okay, next question. Well, first, before I ask it, how old are you in this current moment?
I am 49.
49.
I am on the cusp of the big 50, but I'm not there yet, but it's looming.
Okay, I'm 29, so my 30th is approaching, so I have a similar...
Oh, right.
Yeah.
What month?
December.
Oh, right, I'm September, so I'm a few months before.
Yeah, nice. The reason I asked that is because the question is, where are you now, and where would you like to be in 10 years?
Great question again, Thomas. Where am I now? I'm in a really good place right now because I'm professionally, I feel that I'm at that happy junction of, I've got some really good experience under my belt as a clinician, as a forensic psychiatrist, but I'm still young enough and energized enough to put that experience into practice and, use that for the benefit of my patients and the work that I do. So that's a really nice feeling to to get to, because, you know, like with anything, I guess when you're first starting out, you're just sort of terrified, and medicine is a great example of that, because, you know, the imposter syndrome is huge, because, you know, you're like, oh my God, the day I remember starting my internship, you know, after medical school, and thinking, they're going to find out I don't belong here. I'm a fraud, and I fluked my medical degree, and I didn't really deserve it. But it's interesting, because talking to all of my colleagues, they all felt exactly the same. There's just this anxiety. But then, you know, time goes on, and, you know, experience just counts for so much. And, you know, what you learn in, like a lot of jobs, I think what you learn theoretically in university, for example, versus on the job, you know, the on the job experience is just priceless, because it's so powerful what you learn about other people and yourself, and the lessons that you learn, and all of that. So I'm in a good place with that, and personally, I'm in a very good place. I'm happily married. I don't mind telling you and the listeners, this is my second marriage. So I've been married now for nearly 5 years to my second wife, and between us we have 5 children. Wow. So we're very we're very busy, and but we work really well together as a wonderful team, and, you know, we have that time and space for each other, as well as the kids, which is wonderful. So there's a lot going on, but it's busy and sometimes chaotic, but it's a wonderful experience. And as we spoke about, I'm just about to launch my first book, so that's, again, somewhat exciting and somewhat terrifying, and again, you think, oh, how's it going to go? But it's experience. And in 10 years from now, well, I would love to think that not a whole lot would have changed, really. Because I'm quite happy where I am. But I'd love to think that I would have more books published by then, and that people would enjoy reading them, of course, and that they would get something out of that. I'd love to, in the future, you know, I just need an education, and I would love to be able to be involved in some sort of philanthropic, you know, program around education for people who can't afford education, or, you know, I've seen a lot of, in my patients, I've seen, unfortunately, a lot of traumatized women in particular who have been the victim of family violence or domestic violence. And so I'd love to, in 10 years from now, be in a position to be able to do more in that space as well, because I know the struggles that people can have in leaving those situations, because there are so many dynamics at play that can prevent that. So as I get older, I'd love to be able to perhaps wind the work side down a bit, but then contribute in those sorts of ways as well. I think that would be a wonderful way to sort of, you know, move into sort of somewhat older age, to be able to contribute in that way in the future.
Yeah, it's beautiful to give back. Yeah. That's really nice. So you live in Australia.
Yes.
If you could live in any country, where would it be?
Well, outside of here, because I'm very lucky to live where I live, and Adelaide is very much it's a small city, but kind of a big country town as well. So it can have that uneasy tension at times around that dynamic. But we have a lovely lifestyle here in Adelaide. We have a lovely climate. It does get scorching hot in summer, but we have very mild winters, and we have lovely spring, lovely autumn weather as well. And we're blessed here because we have a lot of agricultural richness to the geography of here. So we have great food, you know, great wine, for example, that's growing all around where I live. So we have a really nice sort of lifestyle here. But it may be no surprise to you that if I could live anywhere else than here, it would have to be Italy. I would think that, you know, as you said, there is something about that continental European lifestyle, like you said, with the French, but the Italians as well, where there's just this sort of this priority on savouring all of the richness of life, and, you the sort of like the long lunch, just the beautiful climate, the beaches, the islands, all of those, the natural beauty, being able to take time to live, and the history as well, of course, which I love as well. But it's more that that relaxed attitude to living, really, which I think is terrific. I mean, I think on the one hand, life is a lot more compressed in continental Europe because there's just not the space. But then at the same time, I think it's great because instead of being in your apartment, you're out walking, you're out enjoying a lifestyle that is sort of more outdoors in a way, walking a lot more, less reliant on the car, all of those sorts of smaller things I think are really, appealing. In Australia, again, because we're so lucky with space, so many people do live in houses, and we're sprawled out so much. We have such low population density that we're very reliant on our cars, where we often, spend a lot of time in our homes, as well. I mean, yeah, we get to the beach in summer and those sorts of things, but it's not always easy to just, walk around, build a sort of community outside of your own home or outside of your four walls. Whereas I have this idea in Europe that there's perhaps a greater opportunity to do that. And, that's something that I've visited Italy a few times, and I sort of felt that when I was there. So that would certainly be probably the place I would move to if I had to move out of Australia.
Yeah, no, that's great. For some reason, I was just thinking, like, so what do you do? How do you handle the scorching heat summers in Australia? Like, how do people manage that?
Well, we stay indoors a lot, and like a place like Adelaide where it gets so hot, everywhere has very effective indoor air conditioning, and really you just have to bunker down and stay indoors as much as you can. But the hard thing is it doesn't cool down at night. So during the day, it's fine because you're busy, you're doing other things, you're in an air conditioner. But at night, when it stays so hot overnight, it can be really hard it can be very hard to sleep sometimes. So if you're lucky enough to have air conditioning right throughout, it's not so bad. But it's really something, because we can have several days in a row where it's well over 40 degrees Celsius. And where we are in South Australia, we're directly south of a large desert. So we have a very dry, oven-like heat that it's like being baked if you go outside. So it's incredibly, it can be very, very oppressive. So it's just trying to avoid it as much as you can, and just try to get through, really.
Yeah, no, that's that's all you can do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Michael, we've come to the final question of Roundtable Chats,
Yes.
which is, what are the most memorable words of advice you've ever received?
Well, again, this is a fabulous question. I think one thing that, when I saw that question, one thing that immediately came into my head, do you remember that movie, The Shawshank Redemption?
Yes.
With, so fabulous. And there was this line from Morgan Freeman's character, Red, in there, where he says, get busy living or get busy dying.
Yeah.
And that just stuck with me from the moment I heard it. I thought, that is just the perfect way of putting it.
Yeah.
Because life is for living, and I think whatever you're going to do it. And I think that was a big motivation for me to finally finish this novel,
Nice.
try to get it out there, because, it's not going to write itself. It's not, and if I really want to do it, I've just got to do it. So that is something that I think of a lot, that we're not here for a long time, really. So let's make the most of it while we are. But I think the best piece of advice I ever received really came from my dad, actually. And it wasn't so much direct, well, it was sort of advice, but so my dad and his 3 brothers, so the 4 of them, they worked with my grandfather. So they were very much involved in the fruit and vegetable industry as wholesalers, as producers, had a company that they all ran together. And as a young boy, I would often go in and work with my dad when I could, like during school holidays and whatnot. And that sort of industry is very, it can be a very sort of difficult industry because you have a lot of personalities within that industry who, you can deal with everyone from the local greengrocer to the local grower to large supermarkets and corporations, all of that sort of thing. And my dad was very much known as someone who could really listen and arbitrate between people, no matter who they were. He was so good at sort of not taking sides. He would often be called in to he had no training in any of this, but he would often mediate between feuding people and whatnot. And I would see all this. And what really resonated with me was that, he would be in the middle of some of these conflicts.
Yeah.
And yet no one ever had a bad word to say about my father. He had absolute respect. And I think that was because he, as we were talking about before, Thomas, he would listen to people. And he would, I think, try to understand different perspectives and bring them together. And I think that is something that has really helped me, particularly as a forensic psychiatrist, when I've had to deal with incredibly unwell, dangerous patients at times who, when they were floridly psychotic and I had to sort of manage them in a hospital or a secure forensic psychiatric facility, I would often think back to my dad and how he would be with some of these people and just think, right, I've just got to, like we were saying, listen, mediate, not judge, not. So I think that was an advice or an experience that has just stayed with me so much and been of enormous benefit to my sort of medical career more than anything else. Just that ability to be able to listen to people, really, which is what psychiatry is all about.
Beautiful. Michael, thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your accent. I'm a big fan of it.
Thank you, Thomas. It has been wonderful talking with you. Thank you so much for inviting me on. It's just been a pleasure, and I'm glad we've formed this friendship. And I really look forward to listening to more episodes of your podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, until next time, thanks for listening. Thank you so much for listening to this special episode of the Roundtable Chats. If you like what you heard, please share it with your friends and family. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and until next time, goodbye.